Hi everyone, it's Mr. Banish, and in this video we're going to take a look at what animal behavior is. Have you ever wondered why animals act the way that they do, or they behave in certain ways? For example, if you look at the organism that's down below in the picture, you're going to see that this organism's chest or throat looks like it's swelled up, or it's gotten much bigger. And animals do this for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons might be that it's trying to attract a mate, and so it's trying to look bigger than it normally is, or it's trying to look flashier with different colors. Another thing that this organism might be doing is trying to hold off or keep a predator away from them, and so they'll do this to try to intimidate them. These are just a couple of examples of what behavior is in organisms. So let's take a look at it. So we're looking at the behavior of animals, and the best way to do that is to start by defining what behavior is. Animal behavior is the actions that the organisms perform. So for example, animals are going to have to track down food, and the way that it tracks down its source of food is going to be a type of behavior. So what we could say is that food is going to be a type of behavior, or how it tracks down food. Another one is going to be mates. So how does it go about attracting a mate? And the other one is going to be how it is going to avoid predators. So I've simplified these down to food, mate, and predators, but understand it's basically how does it get food, how does it attract a mate, and how does it avoid predators. And these are just a couple examples of animal behavior. Now, we need to understand that animal behavior is a complex process. Oftentimes it's involving all kinds of parts of the body. It's not just one part of the organism. For example, an animal gets hungry, and so once it gets hungry it knows that it needs to go after and track down some source of food if it's a heterotroph. And so then the ability to use some learned behaviors that it's going to be able to track it down. You can see that there's multiple different behaviors. First of all, the signal being sent that it is going to need to eat, and then after that actually going and tracking down the food. So those are a couple of types of behavior, things that make it complex. Now, we talked in the previous section about something that's called a stimulus. So a stimulus is, let me get that written down for you. A stimulus is always going to cause the response. So a stimulus is a signal that causes an organism to react. And in class we talked about if I was to take a cold bucket of water and dump it onto someone, the reaction would be that the person would either scream or they'd stand up real quickly. And so the stimulus is always going to cause the response. And the same thing exists when we're talking about animal behavior. The stimulus is always going to cause the animal to respond in a certain way. So for example, if an organism is being attacked, it's going to do one of two things at its habitat. It's either going to defend its territory, or what it's going to do is it's going to run, or it's going to take off. And so that organism that's coming into the habitat is the stimulus. The response is going to be what the organism does, whether it's going to stay and fight or it's going to turn and run. Now, we also look at behavior as a function, and most behaviors help the organism to survive. And so here's a couple of pictures. We'll talk about these in a second, but understand that the function, the behavior function, is what helps most organisms to survive. So if we're talking about organisms surviving, what we need to make sure that we understand is that surviving is actually going to help it to get its food. So a type of survival method is getting food or finding a hiding place. So if it has a place to hide, it is going to, again, be surviving. Reproducing, what does it do to attract a mate? Or how does it go about hiding or resting? And so a place where it can go, and that's going to be an example, could be a nest. So those are just a couple examples of how behaviors help organisms to survive. Now in the picture, what we have is we have basically this organism that looks like it has a couple of eyes right here. And any type of organism that would look to possibly attack this is going to look, again, because of the fact that it's actually going to look much bigger than it is. And so the organism oftentimes will get let alone. Same thing like over here where we have an organism that's hiding in the grass and using camouflage to help it as a source of protection. So again, the behavior function or the function behavior is going to help the organism to survive or reproduce. Now, there are behaviors that are going to be learned, and there's going to be certain types of behaviors that are not learned. The first one is going to be instinct. Now, we know what instinct is because of the fact that sometimes we say that person has good instinct, which means they basically know something before somebody else does. And so we say that it's without being taught. This is just something that you know. All right, so if somebody has an instinct where they're just like they react to it really well, that is because you haven't been taught it. You just know that you have to do something, and it's a response to a stimulus that is going to allow it to behave in a certain way. So, for example, a spider is not taught how to build a spider web. It has an instinct of how to design that. And another example could be a kangaroo. When a newborn kangaroo comes out, it knows that it has to get a source of food, and it knows immediately that it needs to go into the pouch of the mother and to get its source of food through there. And so that's an instinct. When an organism doesn't learn something, it just knows how to do it. It's not taught it. It learns it by knowing that that's how it needs to respond. Another example is a nest. A bird doesn't learn how to make a nest. It ultimately is going to have an instinct for how to do that. And so instinct is a type of behavior. There are learned behaviors, and so we need to define what learned is. So let's start out by saying that learned behaviors are going to be a process that leads to changes in the behavior based on practice or experience. Okay, so the organism is going to either through practice or experience, it's going to get better at something. And this is oftentimes the most common type of behavior that we're familiar with because it's when you come to school, we try to teach you different things and have you practice them and experience them, and that becomes an ingrained type of behavior for you. So think back to last year when you were first learning how to sign on to the Chromebooks and how some of you struggled to do certain things on there, and look at where you're at now. Okay, that's a type of behavior that you have learned. You've learned how to do those sorts of things. Another example is going to be riding a bike. And so this is a very common one. If you've ever helped somebody to learn how to ride a bike, it's not the easiest thing. Oftentimes you'll hold the back of the seat and you'll kind of let them pedal and you try to keep the balance for them. Or in this case, in the picture over here, you can see that they have training wheels that are on there, and so those help with balance. And eventually the training wheels come off and you would learn how to do that. But oftentimes there's a lot of times where you fall. And so learning behavior, it's not perfect for the first time. It's going to take several times. The other example is lions. They do not learn how to hunt down their food. Oftentimes they learn different strategies to try to attack, certain times that they need to attack, certain angles that they need to take. And all learned behavior depends on its inherited traits, meaning that you get certain types of learned values through your parents. And so if some organisms don't have parents that help to teach their young, they're going to struggle a little bit more than others. And so all learned behaviors depend on the inherited traits that have been passed on from parents to offsprings. Imprinting is another type of behavior, and it is a process in which newly hatched birds or newborn mammals learn to follow the organisms, the first object they see. So basically, it's an organism that's going to follow. Organism is going to follow the first thing they see. And once the imprinting takes place, it cannot be changed. And there's a couple of benefits to it. So for example, if we have our ducks here, you can see that when they are newborn, okay, when they first come out, the first thing that they see, which is hopefully going to be the mother, is going to be that they're going to follow her wherever she goes. And I'm sure you've seen ducks that have crossed the road, or if you see them in the water, they're going to follow each other. And the reason for this is for a couple things. The first one is that it's going to help to keep the young near their mother. And so that's one of the benefits of having this type of behavior. It's going to keep them near their mother, but it's also going to help them to identify species that are the same. And that's going to be important for mating. Right, so organisms are going to need to be able to mate with the same type of breed. And so imprinting is a type of learned behavior. Another type is called conditioning, and conditioning is going to be the learned behavior that is going to respond, so it's learning that a particular stimulus leads to good or bad consequences. Okay, and so this one is the most common if you have a dog at home. In fact, there's a very interesting study that was done by Ivan Pavlov in which he would ultimately he would put out food for the dog, and the dog, you can see, is salivating in the picture, and basically its mouth is beginning to water. And so when the food is put out, and so what happens is that each time that the food is put out, the dog would its mouth would begin to salivate, it would eat, and so on. But what happened is that there started to become an association. What would happen is that the Pavlov would ring the bell, and then the food would get put out. And so ring the bell, food gets put out, and so now the organism is going to, in this case the dog is going to salivate, and so keep doing this each time the bell rings, that the food comes out with it, and the dog would continue to salivate. Now, what happened over time is that the dog would, the bell would be rung, and the dog would salivate, and there would be no food that was put out. And so eventually the bell would ring, the dog would not salivate anymore. And so ultimately what's happening in this experiment is that they're conditioning the dog to behave a certain way. The dog got used to every time that the bell rang, there was food associated with it. And eventually when they rang the bell and there was no food, the dog still salivated because the dog associated the ringing of the bell with the production of food, or the food being there. And so conditioning is a very common one for training pets. Another one is called trial and error, and this is where animals learn to perform behaviors more and more skillfully. So for example, this squirrel is trying to get after birdseed, and so because of the fact that the squirrel has probably already fallen off numerous times, it's going to develop a more and more skillful way of doing that. Another example of trial and error is being on your bicycle. And like we had talked about with behavior, it's going to, as you get used to it, you're going to try different things, and eventually you're going to succeed at it. Insight learning is the process of learning how to solve a problem and to do something by applying it. So in insight learning, in this case, the organism in the picture is trying to get at different types of bugs that are in this little area right here. There's a bunch of different types of bugs that are in here, and because this organism wasn't able to get its tongue or something in there, what it's done is it's learned to take and use the stick to try to get the organisms on there and then eat them. And so this is a process. So I'll give you the definition. The process of learning how to solve a problem or do something new by applying what is already known. Okay, so this organism knows that there's different types of organisms that are in here, and so he knows that if, or she knows that if it's able to take the stick and get the stick on with some organisms on there, that it'll get a source of food. And so that's a different type of learning process. All of this stuff is behavior for organisms and how they go about behaving the way that they do. All right, thank you very much.